Okay, so this is the second part of our lecture on part one of Rousseau. And what I'd like people to do now is go to pages 18 and 19 in the text. And on 18 and 19, we see him start to get going with his discussion of human life in nature, in prehistorical, pre-societal nature. And so you can see right away that um, for Rousseau, physically in nature, man was very well positioned. He had, he and she both had a kind of solitary and free existence in ecological conditions which were pristine. There was a lot of food, there was plenty of forest and shelter, there was much to eat and little to fear, especially given our um, abilities to fight or flee, escape artists, trickery, mental powers, and that sort of thing. So, mankind in nature, for Rousseau, this is a very famous portrait. The freedom of man in nature. Remember that he says very clearly in the middle of 19, I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak tree, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed at the foot of the same tree that supplied his meal, and thus all his needs are satisfied. So it's not a condition of scarcity or strife or difficulty, prehistorical man, in Rousseau's conception here. Now he also thinks that the children of this time and place would have been very robust and very healthy. And while Hobbes may claim, Thomas Hobbes, remember from our week one lecture notes, he may claim that there's a tendency of men in this kind of condition to fight and war with each other, a condition of bellum omnia contra omnius, a war of all against all. Rousseau says that's too one-sided a take on man in prehistorical natural conditions. Human beings, yes, they would have been ferocious, self-interested, and self-preserving creatures, but it's that question of self-preservation that would have led them, at times anyway, to flee, to take flight, to scurry up a tree. They would have been these kinds of escape artists as much as they were ferocious creatures. So he thinks that we can find an example of this basically in how tribal peoples living in jungles are never heard to be mauled by a jaguar or a panther, in part because they're able to escape. And we can see Rousseau start to introduce this principle of comparative reasoning about different societies in order to create a universal portrait of human life that is familiar to us maybe from anthropology, if we've had anthropology courses before. Rousseau basically takes the tribal peoples or earlier agricultural peoples that Europeans are encountering in the New World, and he says these people are in some sense just like Europeans. In ways they're actually superior to Europeans. Their robust individual health is certainly more, and physique is certainly more pristine than societalized or civilized people. Um, okay, so on the contrary to this kind of fear of other people that Hobbes had sketched out, Rousseau holds, um, in contrast to that, that the real difficulties of natural people would have been childhood, old age, and sickness. And these are things that we still cannot escape, even in society. But the advantage, if you guys go now onto 21 and 22, the advantage is that in nature, we didn't have all the illnesses that society creates for us. hunger and starvation and the depraved condition that poor people can be in terms of their shelter or lack thereof. And on the other hand, the forms of indigestion and disease that come along with luxury and intoxication and access to overly rich food and all the kind of lifestyle of the enormously wealthy and today wealthy countries, so to speak. So, though we have more things now, we also have worse health, Rousseau seems to be saying. We give many more illnesses to ourselves than we can furnish cures for through our societalization. And he even goes so far in a famous passage on page 22 to say that we could have avoided all of these forms of illness had we simply maintained the solitary lifestyle that nature prescribed to us. Now, some of you might be saying, solitary lifestyle. How is that possible? Animals all live in groups. Well, that's more or less true, depending on the animal. You could say that the orangutan might be an example of an ape that he's thinking of here, that has some more kind of solitary existence than, say, grouping animals, grouping apes and chimps, or something like that. So he's not without any basis in what he's saying, even if he is at times getting some things wrong. Human beings were not solitary creatures, let's say, in nature. But Rousseau says in a famous passage, again on 22, if nature has destined us to be healthy, I almost dare to affirm. Notice that phrase. I almost dare to affirm that the state of reflection is a state contrary to nature, and that the man who meditates is a depraved animal. Which is to say that the very act Rousseau is engaged in, the very act of philosophizing and meditating and thinking about the nature of things, is, in some sense, depraved. It's wrong. Having arts and sciences and technologies, while good in some sense, if it means that others suffer and know injustice and inequality, this cannot be tolerated. This is a kind of depraved condition. People spending tens of millions of dollars on abstract paintings or trying to create rocket ships to fly around and that sort of thing. That doesn't count for anything if you don't have basic justice, equality for human beings and for human life. That's what Rousseau's getting at in a statement like that. All of the arts and sciences and technologies, as long as there's injustice, are merely forms of apology and depravity for the status quo. So Rousseau is making a very, very strong set of claims here. He's basically laying out quasi-revolutionary principles whereby almost any form of society or government, civilization itself, can be said to be illegitimate. These are the strong terms of his text, as we'll see as we get further into it. Now, as we continue looking at 23 and 24, you can see that there's a kind of dynamic emerging whereby peoples living outside of Europe who have recently been colonized and subjugated by Europe in many cases, these people are getting a different kind of measurement than would be familiar to most European intellectuals in the 18th century. They're being taken up several notches. Europeans are being brought down when it comes to physique and even mentality, so to speak. All these meditators and philosophizers, these depraved people, savage people, primitive people, tribal, agriculturalist peoples outside of the European theater of nations and dynasties, these people are starting to look more and more robust and important. So Rousseau is sometimes associated with the idea of a kind of noble savage, the elevation of savage man into this noble condition. Um, and again, this would have subtly undermined an idea of the Enlightenment, which was this kind of faith in rationality, scientific progress, technical progress, artistic and political progress. Rousseau seems to be saying, no, in fact, as things have gotten further along, the conditions have gotten worse. They've not improved. Things are more unjust and more unequal today. And this would have stuck in the craw, in some sense, of people like Adam Smith or Diderot or Voltaire, the famous members of the so-called Scottish and French Enlightenment. Okay, so I'll come back and I'll go through metaphysical inequality in a third video.